PoeTober.
Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. Well, it's officially PoeTober, and I thought one of the best ways to start this month would be to let you know a little bit about the man himself, Edgar Allan Poe. Now, there are a lot of really great videos about the entire life of Edgar Allan Poe, and it was quite an interesting one. But what I'm going to do here is kind of lay on some of the most interesting trivia that I have found on the man and his works, things relating to them. I did have a full script written for his actual life, but really just seemed like it was kind of a condensed down version of some of the other ones that already exist. So here's some interesting facts that I haven't really seen on some other videos, and maybe just some ones that you're probably going to find maybe funny, maybe shocking, maybe a little macabre. So here we go. Edgar Allan Poe was very young when he died. He was only 40 years old. He lived from 1809 to 1849 and actually wrote some of his most famous stories very late in his life. In fact, he wrote The Raven only 4 years before he died, which is crazy because that was his most successful story or poem and went on to become the thing that's most associated with him. But it was only around for 4 years for his death. His name is actually kind of confusing for at least us. It's kind of a hyphenated last name, but there's no hyphen. So Edgar Allan Poe. He was born Edgar Poe to his parents David and Elizabeth Poe, and his father David left the family, pretty much was just born almost essentially, and his mom died very soon after. He was adopted by John and Frances Allan. So Edgar Allan Poe comes from his adoptive parents, the Allan part, so it's not his middle name. It's not Edgar Allan Poe as in the first, middle, and last name. His name's Edgar Poe, was adopted, and then he stuck the Allan right in the middle, so it's Edgar Allan Poe. And he wasn't ever really officially adopted, but those were his basically adoptive parents for much of his life. Although we all know Edgar Allan Poe today, and there are many products and publishings of his writings, Poe really struggled to live off of writing in his lifetime. In fact, he's said to be one of the first authors to actually do so, just live off strictly writing, but it was very difficult. He wasn't shy about admitting that he had begged for money from a lot of the newspapers and a lot of the papers that he would write for because he just couldn't earn a very good living wage. There's a lot of reasons for that at the time. It was very difficult to be an original writer at the time when a lot of times they would take stories from overseas and then print them, and it was just a very complicated time. Copyright really wasn't a thing. So while Poe did somewhat manage to eke out a living, it was very difficult. Now, Poe was a heavy alcoholic, which is known by many people that, especially it's become kind of the cliche for writers to be an alcoholic. But Poe drank excessively, especially in his later years. He did die on October 3rd, 1849 in Baltimore, Maryland, and his last words were, "Lord help my poor soul." There was no death certificate made, even though that was common at the time, and there has been a lot of speculation about his death. Many theories have arisen over the years, mostly because of the strange nature. He basically was found wandering the streets of Baltimore, just completely delirious, was brought in, couldn't really communicate to what had happened. A lot of speculation around that. In fact, some of the movies we're going to take a look at later this month are going to have some ideas about that. He only ever wrote one novel in his actual lifetime, and that is the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket in 1938. That's considered the only full novel he ever did, and it was published in installments, basically like a serialized, what they call it. Back in the day they would call it serialized, so you reach at least like a part of it at a certain time, like you only get a chunk of the story. So that's really the only novel he did. There was the second one started, but he never finished it. Of course, thought I'd throw this one in, but he did very heavily influence super famous authors, Arthur Conan Doyle, H.P. Lovecraft, and Jules Verne. So we can really thank him for helping push them in the right direction. Edgar Allan Poe is said to have popularized or created the detective/mystery genre with the story Murders in the Rue Morgue that was published in 1841. Although this is pretty heavily contested today due to having all of the knowledge of the history of the world nowadays. But many people agree that he was at least the one to popularize it with that story. Even after Poe died, some believe that Poe lived on. In fact, there was a psychic writer who communicated with spirits, or that's what they said. Lizzie Doughton, her 1863 book, Poems from the Inner Life, included poems which she said she had received from Edgar Allan Poe through his ethereal or spiritual ghostly form. Baltimore, Maryland football team, the Ravens, is actually named after the Edgar Allan Poe poem. Had no idea. Not huge into football, but that's crazy. The Ravens, Baltimore, Maryland, is named after Edgar Allan Poe's poem. You know, Edgar Allan Poe is known mostly as a horror writer or deep, dark, brooding, and that is true. He did write a few horror stories and poems, but he actually wrote a lot of different kinds of stuff, and I know he's kind of shoehorned into this image nowadays, but so I mentioned that. He doesn't just write horror. In fact, he only had a couple really horrific things, but they really stuck in people's mind at the time. This is probably one of the ones that most people know, is brought up a lot nowadays, is he did marry his first cousin. The marriage certificate was actually created when she was 13 and he was 27. It's 1935. It is super, super heavily discussed, so I thought I'd include that fact here. Her name was Virginia Eliza Clem, then became Virginia Poe. They lived for many years together up until her death. She was 24 when she died of tuberculosis, and this really sent Poe into kind of a spiral that he had lost her. It actually inspired a lot of his most famous stories, like The Raven, Ligeia, and Annabel Lee. Most of Edgar Allan Poe's works are, well, all of Edgar Allan Poe's works are in the public domain. And what does that mean? It means that anyone can republish them or adapt them however they would like. You ever wonder why you've seen so many versions of the Black Cat, let's say Edgar Allan Poe's Black Cat, as far as movies and re-releases of the book, and so many different covers of all the publishings? It's because when the works are in public domain, anyone can release them. So you'll see tons of reprintings of his stories by many, many different companies. And that's also why you see so many different things from his stories adapted into cartoons, into other little short stories, or incorporated into other stories, because you don't have to pay any royalties. There's no one to pay him to, and they were published so long ago that it's public domain. Well, hopefully you enjoyed some of this trivia. We've got a whole bunch more stuff coming up. We're taking a look at some of the films coming up next for our PoeTober. Anyway, stay tuned.